Welcome to the Blank Family Office. I'm John Baer, Vice President of the Blank Family Foundation. We hope that this starts a conversation that goes past this evening. One way we hope to facilitate that is through our website. This is a lot of firsts for us tonight, and one of the things we're offering is a place for you to go. You'll see the URL on the program card to follow up with questions, ideas. If there are additional resources you'd like us to offer on our web page for links or other things, please send us that. So thank you for coming. I want to turn it over to Kenny Blank.
Thank you, John. And let me express a very genuine congratulations and thanks to John and really the staff of the entire foundation who have made this evening possible. This is a very important evening for us in the mission and history of this foundation. And I know from a film festival I run here in Atlanta, there are a lot of details it takes to pull an evening like this together. So please join me in thanking John and the entire foundation staff for the incredible work they do. Tonight, we take this vision of collaboration to the next level through the launch of the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation series. While we can't predict exactly what this speaker series will become, it will almost certainly include a couple of key features. First, it will reflect the passions of the trustees, which are constantly evolving, just as the work of the foundation is evolving. And while this evening's program focuses on future urban economic development, there will be a whole array of other issues that we may touch on in the future. The future of symphony halls, innovations in green local governance, equity in public education, early childhood development, and the struggle for human rights and economic prosperity in the continent of Africa, where my family just recently returned from a remarkable visit to Kenya. Second, the series will honor the values that drive the foundation's work day in and day out, namely a belief that the best work comes when we embrace many types of ideas and feedback from as many unique sources as possible. We offer this speaker series not because we necessarily agree with everything that our guest speakers will say, no offense to Joel, or not because we feel that the Blank Foundation has the definitive answers to every problem that faces the world today. In fact, quite the opposite. The speaker series will take up issues where answers do not come easily. We offer the speaker series to help provoke our own thinking, to challenge conventional wisdom, to intellectually burst our own bubble, if you will, in the name of innovative problem solving. So enjoy tonight's program and stay tuned because there certainly will be more to come. And now for the introduction to tonight's speaker, Joe Kotkin. Joel has distinguished himself as what they call a futurist, which is what I think is a great job title. I mean, it must look great on a business card, futurist. I thought Joel might fly into a jet backpack, Jetsons theme playing. But what exactly is a futurist? Well, it's a very trendy term used to describe an authority on economic, political, and social trends. I thought of it something as a cross between H.G. Wells and maybe Alan Greenspan, something like that. Joel is an accomplished author and journalist. You may know his critically acclaimed book, The New Geography: How the Digital Revolution is Reshaping the American Landscape. Always ahead of the curve, Joel is currently working on a new book that looks at how the nation may evolve over the next 4 decades. Joel is a regular contributor to the Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal. His op-eds have appeared here in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and he is a featured speaker around the globe. What makes Joel particularly compelling for us is his resistance to fads within his own field. As urban experts jump from bandwagon to bandwagon, Joel stays firm with his authentic observations, his analysis, his criticism, whether it's what local leaders want to hear or not. We are also drawn to 2 themes running throughout Joel's work. First, Joel champions urban policies and innovations that he believes will expand economic opportunity to the broadest number of local residents, not just an elite class. Second, Joel challenges urban leaders to invest in approaches that will attract and keep families in the city, especially families with school-aged children. These themes of equity and accessibility are challenges we certainly all are very familiar with here in Atlanta. As a newcomer to our city, Joel brings with him all the advantages of being a newcomer and looking from the outside in, and we look forward to learning alongside all of you tonight. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome Joel Kotkin. Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, well, I didn't arrive on jet skis. I came in a Prius. I guess that's reasonably futurist. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I have to say, first of all, as much as, we do use the term futurist, or it's been thrown at me. I really see myself more in the light of urban historian, because I think if you don't understand the past, and I think one of the reasons I have this consistent view on these issues is because I've studied the history, and therefore I understand that the world wasn't created when the internet came into existence, and that there is something that I think is very, very important and profound in understanding the history and evolution of cities that will continue to be relevant. So what I try to do is combine a notion of the past with a view of the future. And one of the things that I've always found interesting is how many futurists absolutely have no interest in the past, and, you know, sort of probably not a very good track record on that. Now, I'll start off here with the notion of what is a city about. People don't ask the question, why do we have cities, okay? And how did we have them in the first place? And Jacques Ellul, a French theologian, wrote that, of course, the first city was founded by Cain, who killed his brother. So, urban crime started in the beginning. And he said, for God's Eden, he substitutes his own. And one of the things that I think we want to do as we create our city, and both the city formally and the expanded city, the city that is really the 4 or 5 million people of Atlanta, not just the 400,000 people, because ultimately the urbanism of the 21st century is going to be vastly dispersed, and there's no way of stopping it. And the question is, how do we make that a livable and environmentally friendly and good for families and good for children, something that we'll be proud to know that the next generation had. Somebody asked me today, I said, what was the biggest thing that I would sell Atlanta with? And I said, trees. And I think they were kind of shocked by that. I mean, maybe coming from Southern California, I'm kind of impressed, maybe easily impressed. But you have trees in these tree-lined neighborhoods, and that is perhaps your most precious resource. And if you can develop in some of your new programs those kind of tree-lined neighborhoods, because you do have the empty land, even in the city of Atlanta, I think that's something you might want to think about. The great thing about doing the history of cities is that I got to spend 3 years doing nothing but reading the history of cities. So one of the things I thought about is when you think about cities or regions, if we want to talk about it as a region, all through history there's always been this struggle between one city and another over primacy. Like we could say, if you look at Atlanta in 1900, 1950, it made a move up. It wasn't a serious world-class city until 1990, 2000. Now, one of the things that you're going to be dealing with here in Atlanta in the years to come is you've got other cities in the southeast that also feel that they want their moment in the sun, and they're going to become competitors. You're going to have a competitive product, not just with New York. You could compete with New York. New York was so badly run, so expensive, and had crummy weather that you were able to take people from that. Now you're going to have to compete with Nashville and Houston and Charlotte and other cities that have some of the cost advantages of the Southeast and are very determined to play their role. So, Plato talked about cities always in a natural state of war, and he would say, well, and when he said not indeed proclaimed by heralds, but everlasting, of course the Greeks' favorite thing was to kill each other, and so that was part of it. But he also said they competed over architects, they competed over markets, they competed over artisans, and they of course competed over women. If you know the Trojan War, and if you know more about Greek history, they competed over the same sex quite as much. But this was a competitive environment, and think of it, even though the Greek city-states were relatively a small part of the Aegean, today you have a global and national archipelago of cities all competing with each other. I mean, I can tell you, when Southern California was in very hard times, back in the early 90s, and we had everything, but locusts happened to us. I don't think people in Phoenix and New York were shedding tears for us. They were piling on, trying to say, oh, wow, you want to get out of LA and come here. This is the way of the world. And each of these regions are, in a sense, competitive regions fighting each other, even though they may cooperate at a moment here or there. So then the question is, how does a region stay on top? Herodotus said, human prosperity does not abide long in one place. And the whole quote was that many of the cities that were great when he was small were now small, and many of the cities that were small when he was young are now great. That, in other words, cities, it's a protean history. I mean, when I was working recently in Houston and looking at what Houston was In 1900, it was nothing. It was a dot on a map. It's now the 4th largest city in the United States. I think it may very well be the 3rd most important city in the United States in the next 20 years, depending on the price of oil. So fundamentally, this is a protean process that's always changing. So then I started to ask myself the question, what makes a city get better or get worse, keep its hegemony or not? So I identified these several things. One is the ability to absorb newcomers. All great cities through history have been able to absorb people from the outside and incorporate them. And that, of course, is prototypically, you can go to Venice, to Amsterdam, to New York, to Los Angeles. Los Angeles, was able to accept this huge population from the Northeast and put up with them. And they didn't like them very much, but they turned Los Angeles into, certainly the 2nd most important city on the continent. Lack of upward mobility. This is one of the biggest problems, I think, and I'll get to this at the end. This is the biggest problem the United States will face in the 21st century. I don't think it's going to be an issue of race. Race is there, it dovetails with it, but fundamentally, the opportunities for skilled African Americans, Hispanics, for Asians, and I think what's going to be increasingly common, a mixed race population, those opportunities are much broader than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. So although I think race is a factor, I think class will become a more important factor. I think lack of education, lack of opportunity, that's going to be the big determinant. And this has been historically one of the things that limits cities. If you read a lot of the work I did was reading old diaries, and if you read the diaries of Amsterdam in 1600s, it was filled with this sense of people coming in, and it was a place of opportunity, whether they came from the countryside or they came from other parts of Europe. And then in about the 18th, 19th century, it becomes a more closed society, and the opportunities begin to dry up, and the city stops being the city of opportunity that it should have been. Infrastructure, I'm just thinking about what happened in Minneapolis the other day. And I've been writing about this for a while, and there's a piece in the Wall Street Journal coming out on this soon. And basically, we're not investing in serious infrastructure in this country. And I have heard some very voluminous complaints today about the state of Georgia, to the point that I said, well, maybe the Atlanta region should secede and form its own little city-state. I don't know, suggesting secession to Southerners is probably dangerous. But the fact that investing in your basic infrastructure, if you look at cities that have thrived, one of the classic cases, again, we take a look at the development of New York. It was amazing infrastructure, that subway system, which literally you would bankrupt the entire United States to build today. That was an investment. The leaders of New York, unlike the leaders of other cities, saw that certain kinds of infrastructure were critical to their growth. You look at LA, we have no natural port, and we're now by far the largest port in North America. That was foresight by the people who built Los Angeles. Now remember, in different eras, different kinds of infrastructure make sense in different situations, but the commitment to infrastructure is critical. Great example of what not to do is New Orleans, okay? Now, New Orleans clearly didn't build infrastructure, and what's amazing to me today is when I'm hearing from people, my friend Ed Blakely's trying to make sense of that mess now, but if you look at what's happening in New Orleans, they want to build more luxury resorts, sort of turn it into New Orleans Square at Disneyland. And meanwhile, they're still talking about maybe having a category, being protected for a Category 3. I mean, they're not thinking about the long-term investments that you need to make. That is, I think, critical. Fourth is lack of security. Crime is the biggest killer of cities. And by the way, we now are seeing a resurgence of crime in many cities. That will do more to kill the urban future than any single thing. And we are seeing people beginning to understand that that really is perhaps the most critical problem. And I think it is, interestingly enough, there's some theory now, particularly when you look at what's happening in Washington, D.C., where there's been an uptick in crime. If you get gentrification but no upward mobility for the surrounding population, basically you've created a target-rich environment for crime. And that seems to be happening in parts of Washington, D.C. And then the lack of a moral compass, and that's basically the fact people have to understand that they have an obligation to other people and that they have an obligation to their city. And when that's gone, you're pretty finished. Now, one of the key things that will make a difference in the city, and one of the things that's hurt cities, has been their confiscatory taxation and regulation. And this was Ibn Khaldun, a great Arab historian of the 14th century, talked about why cities in the Arab world were not thriving the way they were in other parts of the world. And he said it was because people had no confidence that if they made money that they would keep it, or that they wouldn't be favored by, taken out of favor by somebody else who had much more resources. So that's an important part. And the other thing was, again, on the openness to outsiders. And one of my favorite historians, Fernand Braudel, unlike today's postmodernist historians, he actually does research, and he also could write beautifully, both in, well, it reads nicely in both French and English. But the miracle of toleration was to be found wherever the community of trade convened. And that's a picture of Venice, Amsterdam, wherever you had the sense of opportunity and people felt that they would be accepted. That was very critical. Now, if you look through history again, the idea of, you thought you were getting futurism and you're getting history. If you look at the development of the first great city, Rome, really the first model of what we have today, again, the development of infrastructure, particularly the most amazing part was the aqueduct. They had running water in a city of 1 million people in about 200 AD. And there would be no way that Rome would not have completely been wiped out by its own filth had it not been for that. The mistake that we make today in many cases is that instead of investing in basic infrastructure, which by the way also creates jobs and opportunities for working people to actually learn skills and do things that are useful, there's also this sense today that what we really have is the city, as Terry Nichols Clark calls it, the entertainment machine. And again, you go back to the question, what's the purpose of a city? Is the purpose of a city to be an entertainment machine for young people who come for a few years, or for the person who's got a pied-à-terre in the city, or for the relatively small group of wealthy people, as Kenny was talking about? And what you find is this notion of the city almost as kind of a giant coliseum. You know, it's a good thing we don't have gladiators anymore. But the idea that the purpose of the city is to titillate and entertain. And that's become very prominent in urban thinking. That was part of what I think you were referring to. So I tried to understand this issue of culture. There's a lot of talk that, well, the real strength of cities is culture, and culture is what's going to make them successful. First of all, we have to understand how culture is actually created. If you look at it historically, usually you have a thriving commercial community. That thriving commercial community creates patrons who then are the ones who support the arts. Then there is this growth at the same time of a middle class. Usually the artists are the children of the middle class. That's usually the angry children of the middle class who don't want to do what their parents did. And so we sort of have it backwards. We say, if we have a great art, we'll have a great economy. There's just no evidence that that happens. And one of the things that we tend to forget about is that causation. Like, for instance, I was reading a piece about Savannah, and some newspaper columnist said, well, Florence was a great city because they had great art, and that's how it became a great city. And I'm saying, I don't think so. If you read the history of Florence was it was a textile town that made so much money off textiles, started loaning money. Then they had the money to pay for the artists, most of whom were not from Florence, and that's where you get that development. You think about New York City in the 1880s, 1890s, Europeans would come there and say, no, everyone's just interested in money here, there's no art. Today, I think it would be hard to doubt that New York is certainly, if not the cultural capital of the world, it's certainly up in the first rung. So first comes the economy, then comes the arts. And then the arts become an attraction to the people there, and it's a good sustaining thing. But I think we've sort of been mixing up the order. So again, I would make the point that if you look at the United States, you look at the building of the United States and the building of cities, it was really a lot about brick and mortar, a lot about building the infrastructure, which allowed for businesses to thrive, that allowed for upward mobility. And that's really what I would call kind of this back to basics approach. And we've done this before. You know, people say, oh, the urban problems, we can't do anything about it. Well, If you look at the history, in the late 19th century, the cities were in terrible shape. There were very high death rates. They were filthy. I took my 12-year-old to the Tenement Museum in New York City in April. And she was amazed that this is how people lived. They lived in tiny little places, maybe 400 or 500 square feet for a family of 4, and they also worked in the same place. During the late 19th century, we made here, and same things happened to some extent in England and to a lesser extent in Germany, where we figured out how to build subway systems, how to build the sanitary systems, build the college systems, build the education infrastructure. So there was upward mobility on a very broad level. And I think that's what's been missing. And frankly, I don't hear Democrats talking about it any more than Republicans. They all want to talk about, I think, more or less more ephemeral issues than the issues of how do we make life better for the vast majority of our people. And of course, the great example of this was, of course, the Depression itself. And I think no part of the country benefited more from the New Deal than the South. I think John was telling me his family in North Carolina didn't have electricity until, what, 1940s. Huge parts of the United States were living in basically medieval conditions until the New Deal. And the New Deal, if you go and you look at the great bridges that were built, the infrastructure, one of the problems is we have been moving away from building infrastructure. I can show you on this chart. If you can take a look, you can see what we've done is our population has grown. The amount of infrastructure investment has actually continued to decline. In the state of California, we used to spend about 30% of our budget on infrastructure. We now spend 6%. No wonder bridges are falling apart. No wonder we're having blackouts and brownouts all the time. You think that's not going to continue? If we don't make those basic investments, it's not going to happen. And that's where I think we've just lost our focus almost completely. I have my disagreements with Jane Jacobs on some issues. I think she, never really woke up to how the society was changing on some levels. But Jacobs had some very, very good insights. And one of the things she said was that what is the purpose of a city? It's the first thing I started talking about. He said that a metropolitan economy, if it's working well, is constantly transforming many poor people into middle-class people, greenhorns into independent citizens. Cities don't lure the middle class, they create it. And that has been lost in the urban debate today. All we want to, well, can we get these PhDs and can we get these hip cools to come move to our town? And if we have enough entertainment and bars and this and that, this will be the key to the city. Nobody's saying, how do we take the kids from working class families and make them middle class? How do we take kids from the middle class and make them upper middle class? How do we take the upper middle class and give them the opportunity to become really rich? How do we take the poor and move them into the working class? We're not even thinking about those issues anymore on a coherent basis. There isn't any thinking about, like I'll tell you one thing in discussions on New Orleans, people were saying, well, we're going to rebuild New Orleans. Nobody ever said, why don't we take the people who lost their homes and train them to rebuild their own homes? And maybe they'll learn how to build things. And you know what? There's going to be a lot of work for people in the skilled trades. Everywhere I go in this country, skilled trades are in short supply. Welders, every kind of technician, plumbers. It's not going to be my son the doctor. It's going to be my son the plumber. And I can tell you from my plumbing bills, it's pretty true. The country is going to be growing. There's going to be enormous opportunity. Nobody thought about the idea that maybe we ought to take this opportunity in New Orleans and use it to rebuild not just a physical city so we can build an amusement park for yuppies, but maybe to use it as an opportunity for upward mobility for the population. What's happened, unfortunately, for New Orleans, and in some ways fortunately for some other cities, is those people have come in there and they're taking their talents and their ambitions and they're applying them in Atlanta and Dallas and Houston. Anyway, that's sort of where I'm coming from in the basic sense. Now, let's take a look at where the country is going, and then we'll try to tie this all together. What are the three big trends? Population growth. You might think it's so unique to Atlanta. It's not. The country is growing very rapidly. That's why there's going to be a lot of opportunities in the skilled trades. Two, immigrants and domestic migrants are the populations to watch. They're sort of the canaries in the coal mine. And three, that the economy is going to continue to decluster. In other words, it will continue to move out over time. If you get nothing else out of this, this is what I'm writing a book about. Think about it in this way. 1960, when President Kennedy was elected, we had 200 million people. We have 300 million people now. We're going to have 400 million people by 2050. That's, by the way, a conservative estimate. Some people think we'll get to 400 million in 2043. Now, what that means is, that means that you're going to have an enormous amount of new buildings. So we got to start thinking about what kind of country, what kind of city, what kind of region do we want to have. By the year 2030, we will add 50% to the space we have now. The United States building stock today is the oldest in American history. There's going to be a lot of construction, a lot of new things. So we have, now the bad part is that obviously that's going to cost money. The good part is there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of opportunity to do it right. And one of the things I'm working on quite a bit right now is the idea of how do we build our cities, our suburbs, our regions in a way that is environmentally friendly and actually practical, which of course is another thing. The other thing we know is the country is going to become increasingly minority. As you can see, in 1995 and then to 2050, what we're talking about in terms of the white population will be slightly over half. Now, I think the big change that we're just beginning to do the work on will be mixed race. In a place like Los Angeles, the mixed races are 20–30% of the marriages under 30. You know, kids go to school together, they meet each other, and you know what happens. One of the unique things about America, by the way, is because of immigration and because of the vitality of this basically this country, we are the only advanced industrial country whose population is growing and is relatively young. And my friend Bill Fry, a demographer, came back from Japan, and he said, how is it that you have, your population keeps growing? Because, there's a shrinking. And he said, well, you know what? If I got to tell you, then you're in more trouble than I thought. But, I mean, what's driving this is a lot of it is immigration, although the Anglo birth rates are a little bit higher than they are in Europe. But it's this change in the country. Now, some people say, oh, I was on the plane with the guy sitting next to me who was from Florida. He said, oh, the whole country is going to be Hispanic. He said he doesn't understand that Hispanics are becoming Americans and we're becoming Hispanics. I mean, that those cultures are intermelding. You know, in the 1920s, 1930s, people would refer to jazz as a black music. I think we call it American music. So I think we're going to look down the road and we're going to see a very different country. My 12-year-old, she doesn't order a steak, she orders carne asada. And now I live in Los Angeles, so, Spanish is a second language. And I think this is part of where we're going. You can see the influence much more on the younger people. Under 18 population is about 61% white right now. It's about 70% among the general population. So what you find is the younger groups are tending increasingly towards this kind of sort of more multicultural. I think one of the great hopes for the South, and it's very true for the city of Houston, where I've spent a great deal of time, is the fact that the old black-white paradigm is finally breaking down. And I think it's a very healthy development for this country, and particularly for the southern United States. Latinos, Asians, it just becomes a different discussion than something that has this huge and sometimes very painful legacy. And it's a new source of identity for the United States. I mean, it is just some evolution that we're going through as a country, and I think it's extremely exciting. And the more dynamic your city is, the more it will go in this direction. I know that Atlanta's been attracting a lot of Latino and Asian immigration. I think that will continue to accelerate. I know that Charlotte in particular is incredible. I gave a speech to Las Noticias, which is the Spanish language paper in Charlotte. And I was first of all, I got this invitation. I said, I can't believe there's a Spanish language paper in Charlotte. And now it's an enormous population. It's growing very, very rapidly. Now, where are these people going to live? I think the population growth will continue, and it will be diverse, but it will be predominantly suburban. The other thing that's very interesting is the rural populations, which had been dropping, are beginning to pick up as people are beginning to, the country gets more crowded, people looking for less crowded environments and moving more in the countryside. I think that we have to fundamentally understand if we're going to keep people in our region or in our city, that most people want a single-family house, 83% roughly, that this is the universal aspiration. Now, it may change somewhat over the years as people get to be much older, let's say in their 80s, they're going 75, 80, they may start to want to live in small places. Of course, young people will live in small places, but they're a small percentage of the population. Fundamentally, you have to offer that product. One of the reasons that we see the heavy outmigration from the Bay Area, from New York, from Los Angeles, is when people get into their 30s, they can't afford to buy a house, and they're going someplace where they can. I mean, that's just the bottom line. If you look at Jim Johnson's work at the University of North Carolina on African-American remigration to the South from California and the Northeast, it is housing prices that's the main driver. So people are continuing to move to the suburbs. That's going to continue, get used to it, adjust to it. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role and a future for cities, but understand that that's where the action is going to be. And if Atlanta is going to work as a region, it's got to work not just as a city, but the suburbs have to work as well. Look at 2000, 2005, you see in metropolitan America, we gained 2.4 million people in the major metropolitan areas, and the part of the central city was 821,000. So we know where the action is. Well, whether it will slow down, I think cities have stopped shrinking. Some of them have started growing. Atlanta, I think about 8% of your growth since 2000 has been in the city of Atlanta, but 92% was someplace else. Again, here's a little bit on Atlanta. And I've been looking at the numbers. In many ways, the city of Atlanta shows some very good trends, particularly compared to many other cities. One big thing I'd like to look at if I was going to do research is instead of taking just the city of Atlanta, looking at your inner ring, that is, let's say, within 5 miles of the city boundaries, because you're an older city and your boundaries haven't increased. Well, you take the city of Phoenix, which is big, they're about 22% of their growth has been in the city limits. City of Houston is about 12%. And I think the difference may be accounted for by the fact that you have a relatively confined space. Just so you don't feel bad about it, everybody else is doing the same thing. Cities around the world are all growing in this horizontal fashion. And there's a very good paper came out of Princeton recently, which showed that even in Asia, in the developing world, but also in France, even when you have $6 a gallon oil and you have great mass transit systems, better than anything you're likely to build here, you still have people living on the periphery. That's just what's happening, and so that's part of what you have to adjust to. Okay. Where do Americans want to live? We have 100 million people, so I keep thinking about, okay, where am I going to stick these 100 million more people? Well, every survey for the last 40 years shows somewhere between 10 to 15% of the population wants to live in an urban environment. Now, that's 15 million people. It's not chopped liver, but it's not the majority. But there are 15 million people. Now, that's where you start to think about, well, okay, I'm Atlanta. How do I get my share of that 15 million people who do want, the city of Atlanta, who do want to go in and live this urban lifestyle, either for a short period of time or for a long period of time? But most people are going to continue to go to small towns or suburbs. One thing we do find is that people are looking for suburbs that maybe have more of a town square or a town center that has more offer than the traditional suburb, but still mainly suburbs. What's interesting is the suburbs are changing. You know, the academic literature is, suburbs are racist and exclusionary. Well, first of all, what we now see is more and more non-families living in the suburbs. One thing we know for a fact now is about 70% of empty nesters, what they call retire in place. In other words, they don't move anywhere, they stay where they are. They stay in their houses. That's where their churches are, where their families are, where their jobs are, since unfortunately the IRAs didn't work out the way they thought, and so they have to work. So what we're seeing is a lot of non-family growth in the suburban area. So the suburbs themselves are going to have to change. I mean, one of the things I spoke about at Aspen 3 weeks ago was that every place is a city now. That the idea that the city is this and the suburb is that, that's going to break down. At some point, it's already breaking down in areas where the cost of land is getting so high. And what you'll see is, of course, the movement of minorities. I'm actually in many cities, the best ethnic restaurants are already in the suburbs. 50% of all immigrants now move directly to the suburbs. The most diverse counties in the United States are in the suburbs. The most diverse county in New York City is the county of Queens, which is the most suburban of our counties, except for Staten Island, and that's also changing. In 1970, I think it was about 95% of the suburbanites were white. It's close to about 30% non-white now. 1 out of every 3 African Americans lives in the suburbs. So the idea of the city is this, and the suburb as that, is really breaking down. We almost have to think of them as a part of a continuum as opposed to a polarity. Now, will this lead to more density? Obviously, if you add 100 million people, you're going to have more density. I mean, the price of land itself will drive the process. How do we do it? How do we do it in a way that's acceptable to people? How do we do it in a way that's environmentally acceptable? That's what I'm dealing with in large part. If you look at Phoenix, a very sprawled out city, you can see that the densities that had been dropping have started to increase. We actually find now that many of the, in the Southwest particularly, and also in Houston, that many of the newer suburbs are actually denser than the older suburbs. Now, for instance, I live in an old suburb built, LA, almost ancient, 1930s, in the San Fernando Valley, and the kind of yard I have, you would have to pay $10 million to have in the outside, because it was an old suburb when it was a bunch of farms that was subdivided in 1930. So what we're seeing is that even in the periphery, you're beginning to see increasing density. Now, we were talking about this afternoon, and I think the question is, how do you get that density and keep townhouses, single-family houses, which is what people want? You're probably going to look at 8 to an acre, 6 to an acre, 4 to an acre, certainly 4 to an acre. And in some parts of California, we're now doing 16 to an acre, where people get this kind of density, but they still get a small backyard and they get some space. And there's some wonderful things that architects are doing now to get a lot of space in a small amount of land. But I know that you've got these towns with their 4 or 5 acre lots. I don't see how that sustains itself over time given property prices. I don't understand how the law of economics will allow that to happen. It certainly has been wiped out in many places. And what may happen is those places will be there, and they're going to be leapfrogged by developers who are going to go 20 miles out further, and they're going to build these more coherent town centers because people will not be able to afford these other places. This will follow with the jobs. As you can see, the job movement continuing to go outside. Here's, I thought, a really interesting statistic. In all the time I studied American urban development, from the 1890s on, you had massive office building in every economic boom. The late 90s was the first economic boom that did not see office building increase in only one city in America changed its skyline. That was Charlotte, North Carolina. And that was for lots of peculiar circumstances that are unique to Charlotte. No city built a lot of office buildings. And as you got into the 2000s, what you started to see was the move actually the other way to the conversion of high-rise offices into apartments and condominiums. So what we're seeing pretty clearly now is a change in the city. So here's one version of the urban future that people have talked about. This is the kind of the entertainment city, the city as playground, adult Disneyland, whatever you want to call it. And that's the idea of what I would call the ephemeral city, the city as entertainment center, the city as a transitory place, generally with a population of young people, wealthy people, and people who basically are there for a short period of time. H.G. Wells made this point. He talked about the central city as a bazaar, a great gallery of shops and places of concourse and rendezvous. And that is beginning to happen. And that is one model, possible model of what the urban future will look like. Now, what that generally means is a city without children. In San Francisco, there are now more dogs than kids. Now, some people consider that to be an evolutionary advance. But I mean, I find it very strange to go to a city and there are no children. And I'm sure there are sections of Atlanta where this has already happened. And maybe this is natural. I try not to make moral judgments. I think kids are sort of a good idea. You know, I have some myself. But nevertheless, what you see is San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, and what you see particularly very little of middle-class kids. In other words, some poor people have kids, and some and immigrants who are who are serving the wealthy people are having kids, but generally very low populations of children. So what we have is this idea of two different kinds of cities. Now, the mayor of Berlin, which has 20% unemployment, is one of these hip, cool cities, and the mayor says, "Well, we're poor but sexy." I don't know. Maybe you think that's the slogan for Atlanta: "Poor but sexy." That might work. And then my good friend Kevin Starr, who's a San Francisco native and a great historian, he calls San Francisco a cross between Carmel and Calcutta, because what you have is you have a hollowed-out middle class. You have very wealthy population. San Francisco has the highest percentage of inherited wealth of any city in America. You have lots of money, and you know what? A company there, if you're going to be there, you really can't have a middle management. Like I was talking to people in Charlotte, and I said, "Well, how come B of A moved all the jobs when they bought B of A?" Which I can't accept B of A being in Charlotte. To me, it's always San Francisco. But when they moved to Charlotte, they said, "Oh, we're going to keep a lot of our jobs here." And what the guys in Charlotte said, "How do you keep a middle-class employee? How do you keep an employee making a measly $120,000 a year in a market where the median price of a house is $1 million?" So obviously they moved to Charlotte. Now, in terms of the future of cities, I would look at these basic ideas. One, cities have to focus on keeping enough of those jobs there so that produce real income. Now, San Francisco, Boston, maybe Portland, maybe Seattle, perhaps Manhattan, although it's more complicated, they might be able to get away with it. You know, they're physically beautiful. They have huge amounts of inherited wealth. They have in the case of Boston, they have the universities and infrastructure that probably can sustain it. I'm not sure the city of Atlanta has it to, I don't think that's necessarily a good option for you. Every city has its own DNA. I'm not sure that being the San Francisco of the South is going to be your future. Now, the other thing is, the idea is creating strong jobs and a strong middle class, I think is an objective for a city like Atlanta, like most of the cities, with a high degree of livability. I think much stress is made on yuppie condos, by the way, which are going to go through an enormous crash, or creating neighborhoods. You have wonderful neighborhoods throughout the city of Atlanta. Those are your real riches. Those are your real opportunities. So that somebody moving here, maybe they'll move into the suburbs, but maybe this will be an option. It's an important option for people. And the last thing to understand that the culture will come from having a strong economy. It doesn't go the other way around. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit broader look at what's going to happen, where I think growth is going. Affordability is huge, and this is one area where you do have some advantages. And then take a look at the movement of educated peoples. Okay. If we look at the growth of population, you see Atlanta has grown very, very rapidly, even more than Houston. Phoenix is the only one that's grown. So a lot of certainly there's a lot of dynamism. The MSA population growth, 2000, 2005. Now you notice San Francisco, Boston, Cleveland's negative, Pittsburgh, the region is negative. The region of Pittsburgh is losing people even in the suburbs. New York has got very slow growth. Philadelphia is relatively slow growth, all of it in the suburbs because the city's losing population. Houston's pretty dynamic. Dallas, Charlotte, Atlanta, all with a lot of growth in the last 5-6 years. Now, this is something that you might be interested in, the net domestic migration. Atlanta has been fed predominantly not by immigration, but by what we call net domestic migration. 3 elements of population growth: immigration, net domestic migration, and births over deaths, okay? Everybody basically, we still have almost everywhere more births and deaths. The growth in Atlanta has been domestic in-migration. Again, this is a regional picture. The domestic in-migration seems to have slowed a little bit from where it was, but it's still reasonably strong. If you take a look at this chart, we tried to say there's a national mean, and that's for average immigration rate and the average domestic migration rate. You can see Atlanta is slightly about the average on the immigration, but fairly high up in the domestic migration. So it's still reasonably attractive. This is 2000, 2005. It's also had relatively strong job growth. Again, population growth seems to track with job growth pretty well. Now, this job growth also includes the higher end business services. It's very often said, well, all the good jobs are in San Francisco or Boston. Actually, those high-end jobs have actually been leaving a lot of those cities for the last few years. Again, high housing costs being part of it, bad business climate. You can see that housing costs are a huge factor. If you look at the ratio of median home price to average pay growth, you can see Atlanta, your home price growth has been relatively about twice the growth of your incomes. In LA, it's almost 8 times the growth of the income. So I think one of the reasons you're going to have a huge shakeout in Miami, Los Angeles, and New York is that the incomes haven't grown fast enough to absorb the price increases. And so I think you're going to have a real shakeout there. You can see the affordability index. In LA, it's now about 5% of the population can afford a median price home. 5% of the median families can afford a median price home. New York, it's under 10%. San Francisco, under 10%. So what you've got is what is emerging is a brain drain as well from these places of middle-class families looking for places that are affordable and have, in many cases, have at least some of the amenities. And there's where I think this is the one that it was brought up today, oh, Atlanta was the young and the restless, you know, that whole nonsense. Okay, now first of all, that was based on the 1990. We've moved 1990, 2000. We've gone to 2000, 2005. Atlanta does reasonably well, but when we broke it down further and we started looking at, after the age of 30, it's to the suburbs. So the idea that all these educated young people are coming to Atlanta, but are they staying in Atlanta? And that's the issue that nobody seems to want to address. How do we take this young person, they come here, they meet another young person, they think about starting a business or having a family or buying a house. How do you get them to stay here? Now, you're not going to get all of them, but can you get enough of them to begin to rebuild the middle class in the city? Atlanta seems to have lost a little bit of its momentum in the last year or two. We'll look for the longer figures. The other thing that just to keep in mind is what drives this, and what drives it is job growth. Now, you look at San Francisco. San Francisco had big in-migration, very attractive place to live, San Francisco, Oakland area, but when the job engine stopped, and it's really still not very strong, the migration of young people. People say jobs go to where the talent is, and the talent doesn't go where the jobs is. It's simply not true. I mean, yes, there are a certain kind of person who will go to the place they want no matter what, but I'll tell you one thing that's very profound is this change in the price of housing, this disequilibrium between income growth and housing prices has changed a lot of that. When I was doing work in St. Louis, I did a focus group with Washington University medical school postdocs. I mean, the creme de la creme of any city would want. I said, what are you doing in St. Louis? I mean, you can go anywhere. You can get a job anywhere. And you know what they said? They said, I'd love to be in San Francisco. I'd love to be in San Diego. I'd love to be in New York, but I'll never be able to buy a house. And that idea that they could never buy a house changed the migration pattern. And that's something that a lot of theorists have missed. The other thing, obviously, to some extent, is the tax structure. If you have extraordinarily high tax structure, that will cause problems. Atlanta seems to be kind of in the middle of the high tax, relatively high tax area. Not as bad as some, not as good as others. Now, given all this, okay, where do we go from here? First thing is, every city's Every city has a different DNA. Every city should have a strategy that makes sense for it. Now, I'm not going to give you a lot of specifics on Atlanta because, frankly, I don't know enough. I mean, Maria helped me a little bit the other day. I've read some books. I looked at the numbers. But, you know it better than me. And when I work in a city, I don't come in with, I've got the formula. I'm going to plug it in no matter what. What I do is I try to learn something. But one thing I do know is you've got to have something that's based on your own reality. So one thing is that you can't market yourself as hip and cool, and that's a substitute for an economic development strategy. I love that slide. Jennifer Granholm is the governor of Michigan, who I think is one of the bigger buffoons in American politics, which is quite an accomplishment. And she had this, her office called me up and said, oh, we want to do a story about how everybody's moving back into the cities. And I said, you mean Detroit? And I said, where is your evidence? And anyway, they never talked to me again. And so her theory was, we're going to do the Cool Cities campaign. Cool Kalamazoo and all this stuff. Well, and as this guy said, you've got to have a campaign to say you're hip and cool. I can tell you, New York and Los Angeles doesn't have to have a campaign to say we're cool. You either are or you're not. Now, so what are the real issues? So I think when you start off with what are the issues that Atlanta, and in particular, because I know you do have a high rate of poverty in this city, is this question of class inequality. I think, by the way, that is something that is going to be the critical urban issue in the next few years. Because what you've had is, as cities have moved to this sort of luring the middle class instead of creating it, what you've been getting is, yes, you've had some growth of this young professional and some, pied-à-terres, empty nesters, that population, and that's okay, but you've had no upward mobility for the middle class, or very little. So I think that one of the big problems is we have, one, with immigration, it brings wonderful things, but a lot of the immigrants, particularly Hispanics, are poorly educated. Their parents will accept certain kinds of jobs, but their children will not take the same jobs. And so the question is, if we don't figure out a way to take these kids, who are probably not going to be, university graduates, but they may be able to learn a skill which will pay them a good amount of money and give them some form of upward mobility, we're going to be in serious trouble. No society can sustain a large number of alienated young people for a long period of time. I think we should have learned that lesson. Somehow we forgot about it. The biggest issue in American cities, I remember, I was with some mayors and they said, oh, well, we're doing this, we're doing light rail, we're doing that. And I said, well, what do you think the biggest issue is? I said, your high dropout rate. City of Denver's got a 50% dropout rates in the high schools. What do you think these people are going to do? You think they're all going to leave? They're going to be here and they're going to cause a lot of trouble, and they're a huge drag on your economy. How do you change that? One big thing is having economic growth. What we found is when you have economic growth, that is one of the ways of providing upward mobility. But I think the key thing is to build that economic growth on a broad basis. What I'm seeing in some very interesting examples of cities that are doing a good job, Houston's one, Charleston, South Carolina, has put a lot of money into skills training, job training. I did an interview the other day with a young woman. She was 37 years old. She had worked in retail all her life. She was making $8 an hour after 10 years of work. She got a job with an industrial firm. She got some training, and now she's making $15 an hour. She said for the first time in her life, she's thinking of buying a house. She's thinking about being able to help her kids go to college. We have to start thinking about how do we create upward mobility jobs. So I think you have to look at creating and preserving the neighborhoods that people would want to live in, and doing the basics, the ports, the airports. I'm sure that I know in many cities, the airports are an enormous driver of upward mobility and of decent jobs. I think the whole idea of building an infrastructure so that people can get around and they're not stuck in traffic. One of the ways to help downtown, frankly, is if it was easier to get there and to get out of. And I don't think light rail is going to do it. I think there are other ways of getting there, but the infrastructure spending. And the basic idea is that the city has to see itself as an organism that is there to help create a new middle class and provide upward mobility. Because if it doesn't, those people will find their upward mobility somewhere else in the region or someplace else. And so fundamentally, we have to begin to understand this is not a political issue. I mean, I chastise the Democrats but Republicans really know better. No one is focusing on the basics. I mean, I was just thinking about all the signs we have of our infrastructure falling apart, our urban infrastructure falling apart, the blackouts that we have in cities. The city of St. Louis, there were months where there were blackouts, as Queens, New York, blackouts, where literally there was no electricity. What is this, some sort of third world country? In some places, in some ways, we're becoming a third world country. Basically, nobody wants to do the dirty work. People want to open convention centers, they want to open up art museums, they say, oh, look at that luxury condo that nobody's going to live in. But all that kind of stuff, they're all excited about that. Nobody wants to talk about cleaning the streets. So LaGuardia, a particular hero of mine, said there is no Republican or Democratic way to clean streets. And LaGuardia is a little bit of family history. He married my parents, but the other thing that I thought was really interesting is that my father's family, it was the first time both of my grandparents on my father's side voted for the same person, because my grandmother was a socialist and my grandfather was a Republican, and he ran as a Republican socialist candidate for mayor. So let me just say where I think things are going and what the issue is. And again, I'm here really to get you thinking about the issue. What is the issue for Atlanta? I think that it's, yes, doing things in downtown is important, but that the issues are livability, affordability, nurturing your great neighborhoods, trying to keep the middle class here for a longer period of time. Take advantage of the fact that Atlanta has lured these people in and figure out what they need when they stay. What you need when you're 25 and when you're 35 changes. You're not quite the party animal at 35 that you are at 25, usually. And think of things like the vocational education, the community colleges, instead of always trying to be in competition only for the top of the equation, because I think people have just forgotten that. And the key thing is to look at the basics things that have made great cities. If you go, and I've read, a lot of urban history, and all great cities put their priority on infrastructure and on doing the basics right. And Atlanta is certainly not too far gone to get it right, and I hope that you will at least use this speech at least to stimulate debates about things and about issues that are generally ignored. Thank you. I think we've got to look at dispersing work. In other words, the notion that somebody's got to go work in a tower somewhere, no matter where they choose to work, is an archaic thing. The Industrial Revolution started commuting. Most people used to walk to work. If you read or if you've ever been and seen the Rembrandts, the wonderful pictures of the Dutch families, and the place of business was downstairs and the family lived upstairs. I think we're going to head back in that direction, which I think is ultimately healthier for our society. But also that people can work in a dispersed way. They can work in a more flexible way. For instance, I was on a program with the head of IBM Consulting. And he said 86,000 IBM consulting employees and 70,000 don't work in an office. Because first of all, a lot of our jobs we have to go places. We're not staying in one place. The other thing that's very, very important to remember is that the next generation, we're going to have a shortage of skilled labor, and those young people are not going to be willing to go an hour and a half to go from one computer screen to another. They already are used to working on a computer. So I think that's one big thing. Second big thing is trying to get corporate executives to understand that dispersing work, whether it means numerous centers, is probably an intelligent way. In other words, cut the demand side on the commuting, I think, is a huge way to go. Third thing is on mass transit. I think there's a role for mass transit. I think you've got to look at more flexible systems like bus rapid transit, which is about 1/3 the price of light rail. The big problem for many of the poor people is they can't get out to where the jobs are, because the jobs are not just in the immediate suburbs, or in the distant suburbs. Well, if a BRT is 1/3 the price of a light rail, you can build, obviously, you could argue, 3 times as much and go more places. I am to live right near the most successful BRT system in the United States, in the San Fernando Valley. it works brilliantly. Meanwhile, the Gold Line, which is a light rail system, is doing poorly. The Red Line gets the subway gets about a third of what its projected ridership was. So I think we have to look at a mix of things. The other thing we might want to look at is within areas some sort of jitney service, so that people don't necessarily have to get in their car for everything. And the other thing is clustering services, so that when you go into the town center, you park, and then you walk to a lot of things. You don't walk to a lot of separate stores. So those are all some of the solutions. I mean, I know that a lot of people are devoted to light rail. And I grew up in New York. I grew up taking this train and the subway all the time. And New York was built on that basis. But a city like Atlanta, you know what? As Heidegger said, the awful already has happened. You already are who you are. How do you come up with ways of doing it? And I'm not going to say don't do light rail and do this. I'm just saying open your mind to what possibilities exist. By the way, the BRT systems were developed in Latin America. They've worked very, very well. And we ought to think about that. Well, those are also numbers that are, if you also added the amount of time it took to get to work and you figured that in, then in other words, you can cook the numbers in a lot of different ways. Outer suburbs people generally actually commute less than inner suburbs people. I mean, read anything from Ed Glazer in Harvard, and it's pretty well documented. There are the extreme commutes, which is what the media likes to write about. But the biggest problem is time. Time is money. And one of the big problems is, where I'm working now in New York, the longest commutes in America are in Queens and Staten Island. Has the best transit system in the United States is in New York City. But it takes for so long to get to work. So yes, they're paying less, although obviously they're paying more in taxes and supporting the subway. So you'd have to figure that out. Nobody ever puts in the cost of the mass transit system to the public as part of the problem. But the biggest thing is the time factor. The other thing about transit, I think it's very important, and Peter Gordon and Henry Richardson have done work on this, is that the way we live our lives, we go to work in a car, and then we stop and we pick up the kids, and we go to the store, and we maybe even go to Home Depot. And so the way our lives are structured, it's probably not that cost effective for most people. Now, if you are working in city government, you actually get off at 5, maybe that you can do that. But most people's jobs are becoming elongated and irregular. So again, I'm just trying to get you to think about certain. I'm not a transportation expert. I can't give you a hard and fast answer. But I think that there's been a lot of acceptance of ideology over practicality. First of all, there's an enormous pool of capital in the world that can be invested in infrastructure. Australia, France, Canada are all doing massive investment in public infrastructure paid for out of the private sector. We've talked in California about developing busways and more busways and also more truckways to get the trucks in and out of the port of Los Angeles. We built with a lot of private funding, many of the structures in LA that we now are using. There's that, but I think there has to be much more of a public role in basic infrastructure. I think one of the things that was part of the anti-government mood in this country is that people say, well, I pay these taxes, and what do I see? I mean, for instance, you go to Texas, and they have lower taxes than California, but their roads aren't crummier, their schools aren't crummier, so you begin to wonder, well, what am I paying for over here? So I think the question is, if people saw that they were going to get something for it, or if you did it for a mandated purpose, for instance, purchase of open space. those things usually pass pretty well. Now, I understand you don't have a referendum system here, or you do? You might want to get one. But as many problems as it has, we have been able, I know it's hard to talk about California as a good example of anything, but you know what? We protected our entire coastline with a proposition. We have bought enormous amounts of open space in both Southern and Northern California. You might want to think, if you get to a point that you just feel the legislature just is never going to get its act together, I don't know if that's a reasonable assumption, that you may start thinking about some public infrastructure. Long term, there's enormous amounts of capital. Instead of it chasing, buyouts of companies, maybe we ought to think about using that capital elsewhere. Right now we're in a period of a huge capital surplus. I think this is a good time to think about this. Well, the fact is you have the chance to start anew. That's always a good chance and a good thing to do. I would love to see, you gave me some description of it. Now, there's an opportunity to build middle-class housing, workforce housing. I would not use the word affordable. I would use the word workforce. What you say is, would you like a cop living next door? Would you like a teacher next door? Would you like a nurse next door? That's a very different thing than saying, do you want a poor family on welfare next door? That's a different story. That's just reality. I think again, from an environmental point of view, if you can build relatively low density, it could be townhouses, 2 stories, 3 stories, with lots of trees, that from the cooling point of view, that's extremely effective. I was going over a huge report from my partner on some of this stuff in LA, and the effects of trees alone are profound. The higher the buildings, the more you obviously get rid of the effects of the trees. You have a green climate. You have tremendous tree cover. When I drive along and I see these concrete canyons, I can tell you what the heat effects of that are. They're terrible. All the steel and glass being reflected, not a good idea. So I think the idea from what you showed me of the plans of having a necklace of parks, of single-family homes, of townhouses, of some 2-3 story places. And maybe, you might want to see, maybe there is a role for a bus route that goes along it, or a BRT that goes along it, or a shuttle service. We were working with the city of Irvine. We were proposing, they were going to fill in the Irvine Fashion Square. When you actually work on cities, your theories begin to change a bit. They had this huge parking lot, and they were going to fill the parking lot up and build low density and moderate density. And they said, but what about the traffic effects? And we said, well, what about the idea of a for-profit shuttle service that was available when people needed it, that was running around 24 hours a day? And so I think there'd be really, what you can do with the Beltline is you can really innovate and really do something interesting with it. And if you have your objective to keep the middle class in the city of Atlanta, it's a great opportunity. That's the most exciting thing I've seen about Atlanta from all the stuff you sent me. Boy, that's been one of the hardest things. There have been all sorts of, let's have a bunch of mixers and, and that attempt. I'll tell you where I saw something really interesting. You know the town, Grand Forks, North Dakota. What they did is they sponsored a group of young professionals, and instead of having them be an adjunct, they said, what mattered to you? And they took on the issues that were important to them, and they just ran with it. There was a street festival that they ran, and so I think the idea is not just to sort of, get them, bleacher seats while the big guys are playing down on the field, but to actually say, what is it that you're interested in working on and that you can be involved in, and let it be kind of their thing. I thought that was really interesting what they were doing there. I know Grand Forks, North Dakota doesn't sound like a great place to look as a role model. I also saw in Houston, they had a very good program of mentoring where they had young entrepreneurs. and where they would be kind of adopted by an established business person. And then those younger people, as they inevitably got older, they became part of the business infrastructure. And I think that was also a very good program, I thought.